Thank you very much. So yes, I'm John Sloboda. I'm an Emeritus Professor at the Guildhall School of Music and Drama, and I'm delighted to be chairing a very topical roundtable directly linked to a performance here earlier today. I'm very grateful to colleagues in the music department for facilitating and hosting this roundtable. I'm equally grateful to our expert panellists for readily signing up to this event. We expect formal presentations to last around 50 minutes or so, leaving good time for questions and discussion, before we move around 6 p.m. into a wine reception, also hosted very generously by the music department. The presentations of the panellists are being recorded, but the recording will stop before we open the floor to questions, reactions, and comments so that the dialogue can be free. This is, however, a public event, so any remarks should be made with that in mind. Before turning to our speakers, I want to give a bit of context about the social and artistic impetus out of which today's linked events developed. About 5 or 6 years ago, Rafael Montero, founder and artistic director of the ensemble El Panesto Hispano, who you'll hear from later on, discovered a piece of history connecting early wax cylinder recordings held in Berlin's Ethnological Museum to the Ava Guarani people of Northern Argentina, from which his family is descended. In the late 19th century, the Leach brothers, industrialists from Rochdale, went to the province of San Pedro de Jujuy to establish a sugar plantation and factory. And they called this estate La Esperanza, which in English means hope. The workers on this plantation were indigenous people held under duress in a form of bonded labour under very poor living and working conditions. In 1905, the brothers Leach invited German anthropologist Robert Lehmann-Nietzsche to visit them on their estate to make an anthropological study of the peoples living and working there. This included various unethical interventions, including making degrading photographs of the people there, both clothed and naked. Lehmann-Nietzsche brought with him one of the various earliest forms of recording device, similar to an Edison machine, which allowed him to record the speech and song of the indigenous people onto wax cylinders. These songs were ritual songs used by indigenous societies, not as entertainment, but as the most profound expression of their spirituality, beliefs, and connection to nature and the gods. They were linked to particular times in the life cycle, dealing with issues of birth, growth, and death. For Lehmann-Nietzsche, however, these were objects of study, to be detached from their context and taken back to Europe, to be put in a museum and written about in the objectifying and dehumanizing way that typified many anthropological endeavors of the time. In describing and cataloguing these songs, he simply identifies the singer by age, sex, and tribe, not dignifying the singer with a name, as would be given to a white or mixed-raced singer. His diaries, which are preserved and now republished, yield many insights into his disrespectful attitude towards those indigenous people, attitudes which, of course, were commonplace at the time. In one ghastly episode, which he recounts without shame or guilt, he persuaded reluctant women to sing by plying them with alcohol. When Raphael discovered these songs, he visited the senior curators at the Phonogram Archive in Berlin's Ethnographic Museum and obtained their enthusiastic agreement to create an artistic research program which would bring these songs back to life in a respectful way, also acknowledging the shameful conditions in which they were extracted. Raphael also shared his plans with senior elders of the Ava Guarani people still living in the Jujuy region today and continuing to live lives of economic and social deprivation, directly stemming from their decades of subjugation. He also received their agreement for this project. Armed with those agreements, I agreed, as coordinator of the El Panesto Hispano Ensemble and its principal fundraiser, to work with Raphael on finding funds to support the project. And in the usual trawl through potential funders, we came across an extraordinary coincidence. There existed in the UK a trust named the Esperanza Trust for Anthropological Research, whose endowment turned out to be from the distinguished British anthropologist, the late Sir Edmund Leach. Edmund Leach was the son, indeed the only son of one of the brothers who founded the Esperanza sugar plantation. And he was inheritor of much of the wealth from the profits of the family's Argentinian enterprises, brought back to England and invested there. From this wealth, he made an endowment to the Royal Anthropological Institute, of which he became president, to establish the Esperanza Trust. We approached the Trust with a proposal for a piece of artistic research to produce a new work based on the songs of La Esperanza and the story of their extraction. The trustees kindly agreed to support that work with a generous grant and allowed the commissioning of a new composition which was written by Chilean composer Ramon Gorrigoitia and was due to be premiered here in Manchester earlier today. Serious illness at the last minute prevented the completed and rehearsed work from being brought to Manchester today. However, we're proud to say that we were able to present today a new work conceived by project originator Rafael, developed in just 6 days, along with our resourceful and flexible musicians. Mbaporenda comes out of Rafael's deep knowledge of indigenous Argentinian music and the circumstances surrounding the recordings of songs of his ancestors. The production drew on the same indigenous resources as Nyandareko would, but remained closer to the original sources of this indigenous music. It was not a composition, rather it was a dramatic compilation using the indigenous ritual music that is the legacy of the peoples of Northern Argentina. And some of these rituals were enacted on stage. And just as Nyandareko would have done, Mbaporenda mixed these songs with text and images from the story of the extraction of these songs. Those of you who are able to see the performance will be able to express your own reactions and thoughts about it. Those of you who didn't see it will be able to watch it later, as a video recording was made and will be published on the university's YouTube channel in due course. But this roundtable is not so much to discuss the performance itself as to explore various facets of the wider issue that this project raises. How are the events captured in Northern Argentina similar or different to other examples of extraction of music and other cultural materials around the world? What is the proper and respectful way of dealing with these artifacts now, whether tangible or intangible? What kind of response can be made in the present which properly upholds and celebrates these artifacts, gives respect to their originators, and acknowledges the wrongs that were done in their appropriation? And we're fortunate to have a diverse set of responses to such questions from our distinguished panel. Each will have 8 or so minutes to share their different perspectives, and I'm not going to make lengthy introductions to each to allow them maximum remaining time for the content that we want to share. The panelists are, in order of speaking, Dr. Alexandra P.Alberta, federally enrolled member of the Jemez of Pueblo, right, Curator of Indigenous Perspectives and Senior Curator, Humanities, Manchester Museum, here in the University of Manchester. Then we'll hear from Caroline Bithell, Professor of Ethnomusicology, here in the University. Then from David Stirrup, Professor of English and Related Literature, Director of the Centre for Indigenous and Settler Colonial Studies at the University of York. Then from John P. Mitchell, Emeritus Professor of Social Anthropology, University of Sussex, and also Chair of the Esperanza Trust for Anthropological Research. And finally, we will hear, of course, from Rafael Montero, Project Originator, Creator, Director, and Lead Singer in today's performance. So, without any further ado, I will invite Alexandra to make your presentation.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. I'm very happy to be here and be invited into this space. I wanted to talk about lots of different facets that got brought up, reflecting at times where the performance today really brought home something that we're working at in the museum or something that we wish to do. And that's primarily through our Indigenizing Manchester Museum program. That started 5 years ago, and that created my main role as Curator of Indigenous Perspectives. And that was a reflection on working with Aboriginal colleagues in Australia for repatriation work and reflecting on the museum not having the capacity to really drive the work forward without having someone that could be there to lead on that thinking and respond. I think most of us know that when you take on a new strand of work, if it doesn't have a named person behind it, then when something happens, it pauses, it stalls. And so that was really important in creating that. Indigenization is not just a less political way of saying decolonization, which we have been asked if that's why it is. No, indigenization is change led by Indigenous people. It is the museum stepping back and responding to what people are asking for and calling for, and changing our practices and what we do based on those needs and those directions and those decision makers. Sometimes it is easy because our processes, we've been on a journey of return and kind of transformation since the 90s is when you can start to see it. Where museums, we move slowly. And some of it has been escalated with that additional kind of resource and looking at, because there isn't a process in place. So my work is working with Indigenous colleagues around the world to better reflect their needs in the museum. And for me as an Indigenous person, I was not going to take this job for an organization that wasn't returning. Returning isn't always what people want, but I always make sure everyone asks. I always make sure people know that that's on the table and that's okay. And that we are very pro and supportive in that area. We're a part of a university, so the final sign-off is even outside the museum in the university for these things, but we will, working with partners, make the best case we can, because where the future of collections art is not a decision for us to make. That's a decision for the people for whom it is their cultural heritage to make. Even if that involves lots and lots of conversations to make sure that it isn't a knee-jerk reaction and it is exactly what's needed. And putting resource behind that where we can and capacity behind that where we can. So I think that was really important in thinking about what I see as a call to action to think about as being not just showing up and talking, but being invited into this space, and how does that change me and how does that change my practice? Because a speaker series has to have that. A talk has to have that. It has to have that direct action. So in thinking about this, and over the last year since everyone's reached out, is what does that mean for the intangible? What does that mean for increasing who we work with and finding that kind of resource where there isn't any? So that's what we've been thinking through, because there's a slow violence and an immediate violence that kind of interchanges between what university museums hold. And that idea of research to be researched by Western academics is not appropriate. And past policies will either give academics in our museum more power in decision making or equal power with descendant communities. And that's wrong. That's inappropriate and it's unethical. And if anybody wants to complain, they can send an email my way, but that's for descendant communities to choose. And so it slows down our processes. So we, in making our collections, for instance, live, we have to understand that researchers will come to those and we won't know because the website's open. But that's hopefully by making our collections search, which we launched last year, more open, is that we will get people seeing their heritage here and reaching out and asking for affirmative action. But where people do approach us to do more in-depth research, we have to slow down and make sure consent is in place. And I've asked, do you have consent from communities? And if I don't see that, it can't go forward. And so that's really important. We're always changing what research falls into that, and we're finding new proposals that make us question that more. But that's really important because we continue to be a resource for exploitation because we have collections. And it's understanding how we don't feed into that, even if it's in well-intentioned ways and well-intentioned research, and actually saying sometimes it's for communities to decide. And even if you think your research might do amazing things, there needs to be consent, there needs to be involvement, and it may not be that you're the right person to take that forward. So we work in that collective way with different partners, trying to figure out what that is and constantly reflecting on how we can do better. Because if we're not doing that, we think we're just the best, we'll become outdated so quickly. But that's not just about us as a place researchers go. We're also in a very privileged position to have loads of school children come. A couple years ago, they ran figures. A team of about 3 people in the museum do 33% of the university's engagement with primary school children through our programs. Now, those facts might have changed, but think of that just a couple years ago. And I was thinking in the performance, you said something really profound around they're not coming for food, we would share, they're coming for money. And immediately, one of the learning team was saying that a lot of kids ask, why did they colonize? And she said, it feels so pathetic and wrong to say for money, but that's the answer because that just feels so worthless and not a good enough reason. And so when you said that, I immediately went, oh, our young kids are talking about that and asking these questions because they can't wrap their head around how that could be the reason. And so that's something that immediately I was thinking about in relation to some of the other audiences that come to the museum. And there's, if you've ever tried to book a visit into our galleries between 11 and 2, we'll tell you it's full of school children. Could you come after 2? Because that's really important. And those kids, they're responding to all these things in the world, so we can be a place that has those difficult conversations that they can't find online. The same learning team member said she was trying to explain to a teacher around return and reconciliation and why that was so important, and it wasn't quite sinking in with the adult. And a little boy grabbed her arm and said, who was 7, and just said, I'm Nigerian, I get it. And that some an adult couldn't quite grasp this, but these do. So we have, and those are just 2 examples of 2 different audiences where we know that we have an ability to start a conversation. We don't always have the answers, and we're not trying to position ourselves as experts in a different way, but we have an obligation because we're both a university museum and we're the museum with dinosaurs. We're the museum that's free for families and the place people can come to without that huge barrier to be involved. And so we have that responsibility.
Great. Perfect timing. Thank you so much. Thank you, Alexandra. So we turn straight to Caroline.
Okay, so from just a few steps down the road from the museum, I'm just going to say a few things from the perspective of contemporary ethnomusicology. And I just wanted to start by gathering our thoughts quickly around the question, by whom and for what purposes were the first recordings made after Edison invented the phonograph in 1877. So here's a quick list. Explorers and colonial administrators in search of curiosities to bring back from the edge of the world, which was part of a pattern of the extraction of raw materials and exotic, in inverted commas, artifacts from indigenous peoples at a time when exploration and exploitation were inseparable. For ostensibly scientific purposes, teams of linguists and folklorists dispatched on expeditions by academic institutions at a time when scientific and scholarly paradigms were still influenced by evolutionary and racist theories. For salvage purposes, the idea that unique forms of music were in danger of dying out and needed to be preserved for posterity, Bruno Nettle talks about recording and notating and storing against some kind of musical famine. And to fuel the music industry, the record industry, when scouts were sent out to hunt for ethnic music. And this clearly raises a number of ethical issues, including appropriation or extraction, often under conditions of coercion or duress, the capture of the voices of victims by representatives of colonial powers. We can talk about consumption of the other. There's a book called Cannibal Culture, for example. Field recordings and sound archives clearly serve the collector rather than those who are collected from. The recording becomes an artifact dislocated from its cultural context and the human body. In the early days of recording, there was little interest in the people from whom these artefacts were collected. Singers and musicians were treated more often than not simply as containers, rather than guardians of unique ways of knowing through music and dance. And then we've heard about the issue of restricted knowledge. Recordings also can divulge secret or sensitive material. And once the recording's been taken away, those whose voices are featured no longer have any control over who hears the recordings or what stories or imaginaries they become part of. Folk or traditional music has also long been assumed to be anonymous. Even today, little thought might be given to questions of copyright, performing rights, intellectual property rights. And among the most extreme examples of recordings made for supposedly scientific purposes in a coercive environment are those made in German and Austrian prisoner of war camps during World War I. Many of the captured soldiers who featured on these recordings were fighting not for their own homeland, but for those who'd colonised them and who often treated them as little more than cannon fodder. These recordings were then added to the wax cylinder collections at the Berlin and Vienna phonogram archives, along with the ones that you've been talking about. So, for example, recordings featuring Georgian prisoners of war included those made in German camps by George Schünemann under the auspices of the Royal Prussian Phonographic Commission that was established by Wilhelm Durgen to document foreign languages and music, quote, for scientific and public purposes. In Austria, recordings of Georgian prisoners were made by Robert Lach, who was at the forefront of the Viennese school of comparative systematic musicology. Influenced by the evolutionist thinking of the time, this included identifying developments from simple to complex musical forms across different cultures within the broader anthropological project of the time of creating a taxonomy of racial characteristics, all very suspicious. In his writings, Lach actually refers to the participants in his recording sessions as human material. Yet these were the recordings that were viewed as revolutionary in the scholarly world, giving rise to new theories about the origins of polyphony in Europe that were disseminated in the writings of Siegfried Nadel, Mario Schneider, and others. In recent times, some of these same recordings have appeared remastered on CDs. This one's called Echoes from the Past, Georgian prisoner songs recorded on wax cylinders in Germany, 1916 to 1918. And they've now helped fuel a revival in Georgia by Georgians themselves, and they're now valued as part of the story of a pre-Soviet history, which is really interesting. They were made under the Russian Empire, but that's another story, which I will move on from now. So, a major sea change in fieldwork methodology was the advent of participant observation and long-term immersion in a foreign culture, pioneered by Malinowski back in the 1920s. So this has a long history, a long development. If we jump forward, there was a further sea change from the 1980s with the crisis of representation in anthropology. Who speaks for whom? And this has meant there's been a progressive shift of interest to the music makers themselves. What does the music mean to them? What part does it play in their lives? What do they value most highly? How do they wish to take it forward to their own future? A parallel trend was the shift towards repatriation in museums more broadly, or giving back, but of course it was never that simple. To whom exactly should the recordings be returned? The direct descendants, mountain dwellers, nomadic herdsmen, museums in capital cities based on the European model? Where will the recordings be kept? How will they be cared for? Temperature-controlled environments? Are there machines that can actually play them back? How will other members of the community of origin have access to them? How much sense will they make without the supporting documentation, which is often fragmentary, inaccurate, and in European languages? So my next exhibit is this very wonderful Oxford Handbook of Musical Repatriation from 2009. 19, which explores these and other complexities across the world. And a quote from what the editors write, they say, as the chapters in this collection reveal, there are more dimensions to repatriation than can be described by simply giving back or returning archives to their homelands. The authors demonstrate through contemporary examples how negotiating ownership of and access to sonic heritage cross-cuts issues involving memory, identity, history, power, agency, research, scholarship, preservation, performance, distribution, legitimacy, commodification, curation, decoloniality, and sustainability. These examples set a precedent for musical repatriation, whilst also problematising the historically transactional nature of returning archives. And this in itself is part of a broader concern with ethics and ethnomusicology. 2003, the equally wonderful Routledge Companion to Ethics and Research in Ethnomusicology, where the editors ask how we may utilise knowledge and materials gathered in questionable circumstances. Chapters include The West and the Rest, Power Imbalances in Musical Museum Spaces, Music and the Immorality of Ethnography. So plays of power then in the past pivoted around questions of who held authority and privilege, who owned recording equipment, who controlled the archive and access to its contents. But a century later, the balance of power has shifted. Questions now include how might these lost voices become part of a living tradition in the 21st century? What might they reveal not simply about repertoires but about creative processes? How might the recordings themselves become part of present-day histories and stories? And something we're studying in class at the moment on the master's course is a special issue of Ethnomusicology Forum, Ethnomusicology Archives and Communities, Methodologies for an Equitable Discipline. So for the final few minutes, or couple of minutes, I just want to zoom in on an article in that journal by our friend Thomas Hilder about repatriation, revival and transmission, the politics of a Sami musical heritage. So the Sami, if you are not familiar with the Sami people, are Europe's only recognised indigenous people, occupying land across the Arctic regions of present day, Norway, Sweden, Finland, and the Russian Kola Peninsula. And historically, they've been subject to political and cultural suppression, including Christianization, land dispossession, and language suppression. And Thomas Hilder writes about how contemporary Sami music has assisted in reviving language, identity, and a nature-based cosmology, while commenting on the processes of Nordic state assimilation, land dispossession, and border creation. And he writes about the Sami Council Conference that took place in 2008. Among the questions it addressed were, how have Sami cultural heritage and traditions been misused by outsiders and national and global institutions? And how might these cases be resolved and prevented in the future without limiting the continual development of Sami cultural expression? So Hilder goes on to draw on Diana Taylor's distinction in her book Performing Cultural Memory in the Americas between what she refers to as the archive and repertoire. The archive, in this sense, sustains power by controlling how the past is represented while separating the source of knowledge from the knower and depoliticising its contents. This is in tension with the repertoire as the enactment of embodied memory, performances, gestures, orality, movement, dance, singing, acts usually thought of as ephemeral or intangible. So the question is, how might the archive be transformed into repertoire? So Hilder goes on to offer examples of contemporary Sami indigenous artists and the different ways in which they've drawn on archival material, including through performance projects in which they enter directly into dialogue with voices from the recordings. And he also examines festivals that he sees as a kind of indigenous museum in which Sami histories are remembered, indigenous solidarity is established, and cultural heritage is transmitted into a Sami future by Sami people themselves. And he concludes, as do I, by saying, by turning archived cultural heritage back into the repertoire of embodied knowledge, contemporary Sami musical performance transforms the institutions of the museum and the archive in modernity, thus highlighting how musical performance has the capacity to transcend efforts to fix, objectify, and own cultural heritage. And do read more of that article. I think it's a really nice parallel to the sort of work that we were seeing, getting a glimpse into of your projects that you shared with us today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We move straight to David.
Thank you very much. So some of what I have to say will echo some of what we've already heard, but I am an Americanist by training, so I'm taking us to North America to think through very briefly that kind of arc from these moments of what we can only understand, I think, as extractive research to a kind of moment of recovery, as Caroline has just been describing. And along the way to think about the relationship between ethnology and nation formation in the early 19th century United States. There are so many moments in the United States that I could pick on, but I wanted to start by just touching on two particular pioneers. You may or may not have heard of them, and I used the word pioneer deliberately. The first of them is Henry Rowe Schoolcraft. Anyone familiar with Schoolcraft? And the other is Lewis Henry Morgan. So Schoolcraft was an Indian agent in Upper Michigan. He was sent there by Governor Lewis Cass to study, to maintain peace in that area, particularly between the Ojibwe and the Sioux, to study and map the area, and to develop on behalf of the state of Michigan an understanding of how those people could be accommodated as their land was settled by incomers. While he was there, he married an Ojibwe woman in a move that I think is increasingly understood as a sort of deliberately extractive one. So he married the granddaughter of a high-ranking chief, and he basically set about plundering her family's store of knowledge. This might seem like an ungenerous way of interpreting what he's doing, but he ends up producing a number of magazines, newsletters, eventually books, not least the multi-volume Indians of the United States, that draws on this, what ends up being several decades of living among the people of the Upper Michigan Peninsula, Wisconsin and Minnesota. He tends, particularly in his newsletters, to kind of corral that knowledge, translate things himself, and publish print without credit. The few people who get credit, usually his wife, but only ever under a pseudonym. And it's not always clear how much of that's her choice and how much his. She will go on to become the first acknowledged Native American poet in the United States. Publishes in both her language, Ojibwe Moin, and English. But she sits behind, until very recently, she sat behind her husband, who himself, in his own lifetime, repeatedly took the position of authority. So he's known, among other things, as the man who discovered the headwaters of the Mississippi. It probably won't surprise you to know that he was shown the headwaters of the Mississippi by an Ojibwe man called Azawandib. And Azawandib introduced him to a lake that was known by the Ojibwe as Elk Lake, which he immediately renamed Lake Itasca, because that's what we do. So kind of we can paint this picture of a man who is deeply engaged in the collection and collation of indigenous knowledge in the midst of this program of kind of cartographic claiming, mapping, improving access to settlers to this area in order to displace the very people whose knowledge he's plundering. Lewis Henry Morgan is a really interesting case, slightly different. very similar periods, at 1840s, 1850s, when he's beginning to really publish his work. He studies the Haudenosaunee kin system, so he's working to the east of Schoolcraft. Like Schoolcraft, ends up producing a very large volume of work, the kind of authoritative research on the kinship system of the Haudenosaunee people, then known as the Iroquois Confederacy. He was an early proponent of social evolutionary theory. So, like Schoolcraft, one of the fundamental bases on which his research is based is that the people he's studying are doomed to extinction. This is a narrative that persists from the 18th century to the present day, despite the presence of indigenous people in North America. So they're doomed to extinction, and they represent an earlier stage of human development, both socially, but also Schoolcraft is really particular in this regard, intellectually. So Schoolcraft asserts that the Ojibwe don't have the capacity for reason, among other things. They don't have the capacity for imagination. So even as he's collecting and translating and publishing their stories, he's framing them always as objects of scientific interest and not of cultural value. Morgan doesn't quite kind of take up that position of plundering the cultural knowledge of the Haudenosaunee. What he does do is take part in the establishment of a group known as the New Confederacy of the Iroquois Nation. So even as he's studying the Iroquois, even as he's working with the Iroquois, he is actively articulating the desire to kind of literally inhabit the ghosts of these people, that he is kind of actively imagining himself indigenous into the space that they are supposedly leaving. They even invent a ceremony, the New Confederacy of the Iroquois Nation, called In Indian Nation, as if somehow one can go through a kind of ritual process. These two men are very explicitly and directly involved in building the nation. Schoolcraft in clearing the land. Lewis Henry Morgan is a major investor in the railroad. So they are actively helping to settle this space and helping to justify Euro-American presence in these spaces as they are excavating the knowledge of the people they are living among. They are very much precursors in American ethnology to the later collectors, among whom, when I first read about Nietzsche, the person who comes most readily to mind is an ethnomusicologist called Frances Densmore. She was a music collector. She wouldn't have been understood as an ethnomusicologist yet. So she starts working in 1907 for the Bureau of American Ethnology, becomes a very influential figure, is a very early proponent of the phonograph, produces numerous wax cylinders among these same groups of people that her ethnological forebears were working with. She produces a vast archive for the Smithsonian, for the Bureau of Ethnology, that will go on to influence practices in the United States for many, many generations. So probably the most famous of the people influenced by Densmore is Alan Lomax, the great African-American collector of African-American music. So we kind of have this genealogy. If you've read anything about Nietzsche was a scientific racist. There's just no doubt he was a head measurer. He did the whole shebang. There's absolutely kind of no questioning of the negative qualities of his credentials. Densmore, I think, is a more ambivalent figure. On the one hand, she's working under the same sort of salvage ethnographic assumption that the people she's looking at, people she's talking to, are doomed. They are vanishing. But unlike many of her contemporaries, she keeps exceptionally detailed documentation of everybody she speaks to, of the things they speak about, of the places they speak in. So if we think to later kind of examples of people like Clifford Geertz and his thick description approach to anthropology, she's doing something that is way ahead of its time. But as many Indigenous commentators have noted. She falls into all the same kinds of traps that fellow collectors do. So she's often recording ceremonial songs at ceremonial sites, which she knows she shouldn't be doing. She is she decontextualizes the work that she's recording in various different ways. She treats her subjects ultimately as data, data resources rather than as people, and she forces, because she's trained in European notation. She forces what she's listening to into a language that is perhaps alien to it. But as with the story that Caroline just told, there has been in the last 20 years really a very significant amount of work done by Indigenous communities with various of those groups of recording that takes us into a period very much of recovery, of resurgence. So among them we have a Lakota project produced by a group of Lakota singers called the Densmore Repatriation Project, where they are using those wax cylinders and re-recording songs, some of which haven't been publicly sung for over 100 years, relocating those songs in their kind of ceremonial and epistemological frameworks, and returning songs to the community in a very direct and interesting way. And among other things that they highlight is the ways in which these wax cylinders are often language tools. So just as those earlier processes of collecting participated in the destruction of kind of culture and language and other aspects of Indigenous life, these wax cylinders are helping people to reclaim some of that knowledge.
David,
I will stop there then, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much. John.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. And I want to start off by thanking the performers, actually, Rafael, other performers, and John himself for putting together this tremendously moving performance in quite difficult circumstances, and at the last minute. It was really wonderful to see. As you'll have heard, the recordings upon which the works were based were taken from Indigenous labourers on the Esperanza sugar plantation in Argentina, which were owned by the Leach family from the 1880s until the 1960s. Now, I'm chair of something called the Esperanza Trust for Anthropological Research that was set up by Edmund Leach, who is the son of one of the so-called Leach brothers, who owned the plantation and ran the factory for that period. Now, he was also a professor of social anthropology at the University of Cambridge, and perhaps the best known, at least publicly, social anthropologist of the kind of mid to late-ish 20th century in the UK. So much so that he even delivered the prestigious BBC Reith Lectures in 1967. I mean, I can only think of the possibility of having an anthropologist in the contemporary scene who was as well known as that, and perhaps I wouldn't now have to be an emeritus professor and still have a job at Sussex. But anyway, that's another story. Now, it's worth saying that Leach's anthropology was very, very different from that of Lehmann Nietzsche. Both Caroline and David have alluded to the developments in the discipline, and I think it's fair to say that actually the discipline shares only a name with much of that earlier activity, which was done under the name of anthropology. Very, very different. Representing this shift from an evolutionary, and in Lehmann Nietzsche's case, eugenic and specifically racist, form of hierarchizing and extractive anthropology, to a form of cultural relativism that takes seriously the perspectives and worldviews of the people that anthropologists seek to understand. Edmund Nietzsche never travelled to Argentina, despite being very widely travelled. He worked in China before the Second World War. He worked in Burma during it, where he conducted his first anthropological study of the political systems of Highland Burma, and also worked in Sri Lanka. by all accounts, he was very reluctant to engage with the family business. As I said, he never went to Argentina. One of the more controversial statements that he made in the Reith lectures was that the most dangerous institution of the contemporary world is the family. And this demonstrates to a certain extent his relationship to the family. He was estranged from them. And refused to engage with the family business, perhaps because he was embarrassed about the colonial legacy. Nevertheless, he was involved in the winding up of the business in the 1960s and used his inheritance to fund the Esperanza Trust. The original bequest which came to the trust was shares in the plantation. And he would have seen this as a kind of anti-colonial or decolonial act, putting the money to good use. Indeed, the earliest recipients of the funds from the trust were aspiring scholars from the former British colonies, from Sri Lanka, from Pakistan, scholars who were funded to carry out research, anthropological research, in service of their own decolonising societies. Now, all of that said, the trust welcomes this opportunity that the Nyandareko and now, so I'm going to mangle this, Mbaporenda project or projects has given us to revisit the origins of the trust. Something which certainly I didn't realise when I took on the chair of the trust, and it's part of the. I mean, there's a lot of horror in the kind of current and contemporary kind of decolonising moment, but I think there's also joy potentially to it, and this is part of the joy of that, is to revisit and to start to think about what to do and how to respond. So we've been working on a response and working on a plan of action. And we've formulated a statement of sorts that the Esperanza Trust acknowledges the unequal power relations inherent in the Leech Argentine states during the colonial era and the history of exploitation and extraction that it represents. Not only extraction of intellectual property, of intangible heritage, but also literal extraction of labour and money, or it's transferring to cash. It acknowledges the wealth of the estate, including the bequest to the trust, was created through this exploitation and extraction, and has resolved to move forward with full accountability for this legacy. Now, the remit of the trust is to promote education and research in anthropology as a discipline. We're currently working through and have established a working group to try and think about the kinds of ways in which we might use that remit, or we might need to have to adjust that remit in order to acknowledge the history of the plantation, but more importantly, think through how the trust might make a meaningful contribution to the lives of the descendants of those who worked on the plantation and in the factory. We're working with so we're looking at what we can and can't do, and also what we should and shouldn't do as part of this process. We're working on the basis of a number of principles. Firstly, collaboration and participation, or participatory. So we've been collaborating with Rafael, with local Indigenous anthropologists and other scholars to try to get a picture, partly of kind of what happened during that era, but then more importantly, what can be done to help the communities which are suffering at the moment in significant poverty. We have a principle of equity, and this is equity among groups, communities, which maybe they're local and have their lives and the lives of their ancestors affected by the acts of the Leech brothers. Principle of transparency, as much as possible, to keep open about the kinds of engagements and interventions that we might make. And then finally, where possible, sustainability. That there might be a temptation to, in a sense, kind of throw money at a problem, but we need to make sure that what we're doing is going to last and going to be a meaningful contribution. The first point of that is to commission a piece of research, which we've been in the process of doing with Agustin Diz, who is a social anthropologist, actually of Argentinian origin. He's not indigenous, but he is Argentinian. And he's been working for a long time among Guarani groups in the neighbouring province to Jujuy of Salta, looking precisely at indigenous labour relations, indigenous labour exploitation, particularly in the mining industries and extractive industries. But he's also moving now to thinking about the sugar plantations and their impact. So he's planning an initial research trip of a kind of scope and variety in July, where he's going to be consulting with local scholars, consulting with local community leaders to think about the kinds of projects that we might be able to put into place, or think about the kinds of existing projects, processes that we might be able to contribute to as we take the trust forward.
Thank you, John.
Is that less than 8 minutes?
It's bang on.
Oh, perfect.
And finally, to Rafael.
Well, hello everybody here. I am very happy to be today, also in this lovely community. I have been listening to you all. I'm very happy to have also Native American person here in Manchester, and how wonderful these things in Manchester are happening. I'm not very fond of the British Museum, to be honest, because there are some objects there that, well, I don't know if this is still British Museum or maybe we can change the name of that museum with those objects. I heard also with much attention what Mrs. Bithell said, and I have also one of those CDs. Those CDs come from Germany, right?
Yeah, Susanne Ziegler.
I have the one of where the wax cylinders are.
Yeah.
Which is also a very interesting thing. I haven't been listening to what you said also with attention. Because the word repatriation, the word indigenous music, what to do. When I found this music, I really first, in the pandemic, I found the photos of our ancestors, what you have seen 3 here. And I read the horrible conditions they were made. I was horrified. I was born in San Pedro de Jujuy, and La Esperanza is just 3 miles away. And especially when I saw one of the photos of these men, whose name is not there because we were at that moment, like when the Spanish Empire came to us, and they didn't know if we had soul 500 years ago. It looks like in 1905, people didn't know if we had souls. At least we didn't have names, because none of the people portrayed there or in the phonographic archives have names, surnames. It's just a man, woman, 35 years old. So we were objects. We were not human beings. And I ask you, when you meet indigenous people of other cultures, and be honest with yourself, do you think you look at them at the same level of you? Or you think you are British, you speak English, or Americans speak English, and others are like that? All cultures are at the same level these days. Probably at that time, the system didn't want us to be as important, because that was a weapon of dominating, colonizing, exploiting, and making us work for, in this case, for the English. We didn't want to be Mbaporenda. By the way, Mbaporenda is indigenous name in Guarani that we give to La Esperanza, because that's the place where you British made us work. We didn't want to work there, because our community, our indigenous system, was not based in producing and making money. Because the important things for us are things that we can eat. Like, as you know, many products come from Latin America, like potatoes, tomatoes, peppers. Those are important things. But just producing, helping to produce sugar cane in order to then sell sugar in England and other places and make people addicted. We have a lot of diabetes in our indigenous communities in Northern Argentina. Thank you, Family Leach, for making us diabetical. Thank you for bringing the sugar addiction to the world, because that's the way you were rich. And we were working with you, women and children. That city, I have the Argentinian one, which is the wax cylinder, what my ancestors Guarani, Chorote have been registered without name. I felt very, very concerned when I saw that there were wax cylinders in Berlin, and at that moment I was living in Cologne, Germany. And I said, oh, there's the name of San Pedro de Jujuy here. Then I wrote to them, I say, I'm coming from San Pedro de Jujuy. I sent you a copy of my passport, because in Germany they are very picky with such formalities. So I say, well, I am based in Germany. I want to know what is about, what those wax cylinders are. And they sent me that CD, which probably that CD and that music is much more important for you white people than for us, because we don't need to objectify our music, because we still are singing most of those songs, and particularly Santísima Trinidad, which we heard in one of the wax cylinders and made me cry when I heard that. We are still singing the same melody and the same words with the same rhythm these days. And when I found that, I was also in a journey when I found and I heard for the first time that music, and then I asked myself, do we really, what is this? This is the first time the Walter Leach is bringing indigenous to Mr. Lehmann Nietzsche, because he's interested in this Chaco indigenous, because we were the other. We were exotic. There was not much information about us. There was information about the Incas and the pentatonic music, but not about other music. So it's very interesting material to research and to write books, you white people, because she's going, and also is Anglo-Saxon or Germanic or white European ego discovering something which was already there, like when the Spaniards and Portuguese discovered America. Did you discover us, guys? Or did we discover you, white people? So who writes? Who has the right to decide who is discovering who? Probably not we. Also because that word diversity in this country in England, because I'm living in London now, diversity and the colonizing is very important. It's happening in this country, guys, when a white person decides in the system that it will happen. Not with people like me or black people will go to the museum or somewhere and say, we want to decolonize, because it happened to me in London and I was cancelled. I have an ensemble for Baroque indigenous music, and the festivals of early music don't want us, because we are not doing Anglo-Saxon composers like Handel or Purcell. There are enough good people who are doing that. My ensemble is doing indigenous Baroque music, but it still looks like in England, the music, the early music, the Baroque music, has still to be white to be in such festivals like Bach, Monteverdi. But I tell you, there is much in the world, much more than Bach, Monteverdi, Purcell, Handel, and all those wonderful names. And we are doing indigenous Baroque music and Baroque music is not only European, like a German guy told me. We had also Baroque music. We heard from the Europeans, and we developed also our Baroque music, our Baroque sculptors, our Baroque churches, which are different from your ones. But when I say that, I am a POC person. I am not hurt. I need a white, an Anglo-Saxon in the system to say, yes, diversity, decolonizing. And when that person decides, then they call me. Since you are white here, please help me to be part of the system with the word diversity and decolonizing, because diversity is part of me. You are white, and we have already a lot of years of your domination telling the world how superior you are. Please give us a space and pay us as well as you pay to the white musicians, because we also need to live. We are freelance musicians. We are doing indigenous Baroque music. And Baroque music, for the people who will see this in YouTube later, Baroque music in indigenous languages is something that we are doing because we speak the languages, we understand this music. Also, there are some Anglo-Saxon group who did indigenous or Bolivian Baroque music. Are they indigenous? Are there South Americans? Are there Anglo-Saxons? You will know later when you research in Google more about that. And you will compare how is an interpretation of indigenous Baroque music made by Anglo-Saxons, which are some time ago very eager to have material to land from us. Now they are taking our scores, they are taking our knowledge of music, and they are doing CDs and selling everyone. I think that's called cultural appropriation, isn't it? We are not receiving anything. We are still object. We are still the research. We are still telling. They are still observing us, as Lehmann Nietzsche did in 1905. We are just singing or playing. They are in our churches. You Anglo-Saxons, you write the books, you do the CDs, and you sell all over the world. How fantastic your interpretation of Baroque music from Bolivia, Peru, or Mexico is. It's still wanting to be the paradigm, the example. Don't you think it's time to change this? Don't you think that it's time to tell indigenous people that they probably are doing better than you are doing? Or who has to decide who does it something correct or not? Is there something correct or not? What do you think? I leave this question. And please, any questions you can anytime write to us. We are in Instagram, as El Parnaso Hispano with Y. And thank you very much for coming today. And let's hope that the times will change, and also the mentality in these colonizing countries also change, listening to us, and know they take the initiative. We had to wait so much time for Black Lives Matter, even when there are so much black people living in this country. But someone had to decide from the system to do justice. Please allow us to call justice for ourselves. We don't need an Lehmann Nietzsche. We don't need Mr. Hilder to do that. We want to write what this music or these objects in the museums are, not you, because those things belong to us. And probably that CD was what we say, whatever white Anglo-Saxon person wrote. Very nice for you, but we wouldn't do that because those subjects are not probably important. So how nice that this dialogue is happening, and how nice it that we can understand now and in the future. Yasurupai, thank you so much. Muchas gracias.